Drawing a wine glass. It's going to be a first tutorial instruction video about how I would go about drawing something like this. In this particular case, we're going to simplify things a little bit and go straight from a photograph, which I think is a great way to start learning. And in particular, we're going to go straight from a photograph and go right next to it so that we can gauge things relatively simply. And we're going to sort of reinforce the notion of how we're finding all these aspects related to the subject matter that we're drawing and then relating those to our drawing. In this case, it's going to be right next to each other, so it'll be nice and handy. When you start scaling up or scaling down, it won't be the same, but the idea of still identifying these significant aspects of whatever you're drawing will be critical to do at first, and then figure out how to do them in either a scaled up or a scaled down fashion. So I'm going to redo that, and I have a reference photo here that I've taken back the opacity because it was too hard to draw on that dark image. Graphite wasn't showing up at all. So just the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at this outer frame. Now, we've been talking about rectangles, and I use my little tic-tac-toe analogy. That would be a very big middle square for the for tic-tac-toe. But these little overhang, over whatever you call it, extra, may not seem that important, but I tell you, the more I draw, the more important it seems like they become. In large part due to the fact that when you're drawing something and you have a shape with some sort of bounding outer line, the way that this part actually ends up relating to that original line is very important. And if we're just sort of thinking it as some kind of thing, doesn't really matter, some kind of, I don't care, that starts defining this line as something that would potentially go in a wacky direction. So it's not only important to define what is up and down, but it helps to make sure you are keeping that consistent. I'm going to make sure that this keeps going consistently straight down, and this consistently straight across. And that will inform the next thing that I draw. Okay. So there's the outer rectangle, or the frame. And one of the ways we've been talking about thinking about any rectangle is the proportions of one side to another side. I like choosing the short side and figuring out how many shorts are in the long. And another way I like to think of it is just how many squares, how many of the biggest squares I could sort of fit in to this rectangle. And I'm going to do that by measuring the distance of that shorter of the parallel lines. And to clarify, the set of lines I'm talking about, the horizontals are shorter than the verticals. So I'm going to take one of whichever is shorter and then use that one to measure it so it's the same distance that way. And that will create a, theoretically, a one-to-one square. Squares are tricky, especially when you're looking at squares. I'm looking at it sort of flat. Anyways, next square would be something like that. So this is a great example of, while the square thing can be useful, it's oftentimes annoyingly inexact, and you end up with fractions that are, I don't know, trickier than they're worth. But so I would call this this rectangle, the outer rectangle, I would say it is one. Here, I'll draw them over here. There's one. There's another one. That's probably about a fifth. So you'll see that gets, yeah. But it's good to know. So 1 to 2 and 1/5 is that outer frame. So this side is 2 1/5 times bigger than this side. Another way to describe the proportions of any rectangle, well, I should say, yeah, rectangle by definition is parallel sides, sure, is by determining a diagonal line running from one corner to another corner, and the angle of that diagonal is something we can use to great effect, and in particular since we've already defined what up and down is and what side to side is, this diagonal will take advantage of both of those and define the proportions of this outer frame. So let's just go ahead and copy that rectangular frame. I'm going to extend this guy out. That's a guy, apparently. And this line out as well. It's one of the handy things of doing this one-to-one. If I am doing it one-to-one, one of the handy things, and when I say one-to-one, I mean the exact same dimensions, so I'm not scaling up or scaling down. Then I can use that fact to help identify aspects about whatever it is I'm drawing. In this particular case, the outer rectangle. I'm measuring what the width distance is with my pencil tip to my thumbnail, and then doing that again, test it. That seems pretty close. And then I can tell that this line I've been a bit sloppy with, and it's not really horizontal. I will say, you've already noticed me quite a bit angling my piece of paper, which more and more I'm fine with. It is a good skill to be able to make sure you can draw everything perpendicular and not shifting around whatever you're drawing on to compensate and make it easier to draw a straight line. But it's okay. It's fun. I'm still having fun. And that's the important thing. Seriously, I think there's too much worrying about doing it right or wrong, and fear of doing it wrong, because that will start bad habits. I certainly get that sometimes how you've learned how to do something might be helpful to unlearn eventually. But the fear of, I have found for me, and I feel like a lot of my students, kind of letting the fear of not wanting to learn bad habits has a way of making you not learn any habits. I'm going to come down off my soapbox now and continue this rectangle. So I've tried to emulate this diagonal here, and hopefully you've noticed that I don't try to do the whole darn thing in one shot. That's a great skill to be able to do. I'm ghosting everything in, light and sketchy. I aim towards one corner, I aim towards the other corner. I kind of sketch the middle to try to start connecting them, and then I go for it. So between the, here's a good example. Vertical straight is going to be challenging at best. So there's a pretty good example of, it seems to me that the diagonal is pretty close. I can also check again. I can measure if this seems like it's still lining up, and it does seem like it. All of these things are helpful techniques to know and to practice, and then to be able to use if you choose to be really accurate in your drawing. If you couldn't care less, then you're welcome to start drawing. But I do find the more I get familiar with everything about this drawing, how much easier it is to do it in a way that's enjoyable and relatively accurate. So let's say that's that for the, I could think about those squares, but I'm not going to worry about those too much. And in fact, a lot of these lines will start just getting in your way, so rubbing them out a little bit. Now I'm going to move to the actual wine glass itself. And if you remember, we talked about finding the top, the right, the bottom, and the leftmost points. So we're going to be creating a bounding box around the object. We have an idea now of the proportions of the frame, but I'm going to create a rectangle, or bounding box, often referred to as, around the object itself. say the bottom is right about there. So once I have these, I do my little crosshairs, I might call them, but I just sort of imagine I'm just trying to complete a rectangle around that object, and I do find instead of trying to draw a wicked long straight line, I can sort of imagine where this one would be aiming. Draw a little tick mark and do the same for this direction. That will make it easier when I get down to here where it's much further away. Seems pretty close. So does that. I can use my pencil to help see if I'm relatively straight. I think that's okay for now. Then I will go ahead and sketch in said bounding box. Oftentimes same kind of thing. I'm not really doing it now, but for any sort of long line, I feel like I need to break it down if I'm going to have a sporting chance. Pointing that way, now pointing this way, sketching the middle. That's okay. And this will be telling me a lot of things as I continue to just sort of gaining information about this object. I'm going to clean this up a little bit. Once I have the bounding box of the actual object, and even before that, it is good to, I do what I call scanning. So I will sort of take my pencil and just start scanning to originally even find my top and bottom points. And an object like this, it's fairly obvious. But over here, as you can tell, that's the kind of thing where it might be easy to just assume that the top of the rim here is the furthest to the right, and clearly it's not. Same thing with the top of the rim here. So as I've scanning up and down and figuring out tops and bottoms, and I'm looking also eventually after that, I'll look for any sort of significant change in the direction of the outer contour, or just any landmark sort of event that's obviously something I'm going to want to be aware of. Because this is a cylindrical item, this is especially important to make sure I have a great sense of what is horizontal and eventually how those will relate to what I'll go ahead and draw in now, which is a center axis. I'll sketch that in. Should I do that first or the I'm not going to do that first. I'm going to sketch in the bounding box for the glass of wine. So luckily we can just extend that line right across. Luckily we can extend this one right across. Just kind of double check to make sure we're making a straight line, and indeed it's horizontal. It is good to, if you are going to sort of angle your paper to help you draw a straight line that's at a comfortable angle for how your arm and hand wants to work, do double check and set it up straight and make sure that indeed that what you think you're drawing is as a horizontal for the overall drawing actually is horizontal. The part that's a little bit trickier is figuring out, so we have this and this. To find the sides, if we were drawing this thing right above, we could extend things this way. But since we're not doing that, we sort of have to take some measurements here to get it accurate. There's a couple ways we can do that. I will sketch in the center point here of the main frame. That may have been a smart thing to do earlier, but I'm doing it now. And then we can sort of gauge how far between these guys that line is. We can emulate this center line and be pretty sure of that. That was surely not very center, so I want to be more sure, assuredness wise. Another thing that will help, it's a good example. When I was just sort of looking at that tick mark, I was kind of angling that way, so it was kind of unclear, ambiguous as to where it was. If I extend them out a little bit, it makes it that much easier to gauge that actual space. I think that's okay for now. And I can estimate just about how far, percentage-wise, it seems like this is thinking sort of percentage-wise, so, or fraction. So if that's about halfway between here and here, maybe that's not quite halfway again. So if I'm doing that, if that's about halfway there, that needs to come over a little bit, I think. And this is just we're figuring out how far in to come for the sides of our bounding box. We could, this is another example where we could just take a straight old measurement. Let's see. But the skill is good to have. It's good to have these other techniques that are going to be necessary when we're trying to scale things up or down. Here, I'll do this again. I'm trying to gauge. It seems like indeed that's as wide as from there to there as from here to here. From there to there as from here to here. And once again, it's close enough for me. You might want it a lot more exact. You might have decided long ago that this is way too technical for you. But this is all sort of keeping it light and sketchy so I can adjust on the fly as I go. And then when all these marks start getting just way too obnoxious, I'll knock them back a bit. Sometimes I'll do that with a rolled up eraser. I still want them, I want to know where they are. But it's kind of nice to clean everything up. It's not so noisy. I was going to say the other way that this is the point of that bounding box around the wine glass. So another fun way to find a point like that, since I know this point, and I know where this line comes, is by using a diagonal. Same sort of fashion here. This idea of triangulation is a really powerful tool, but I feel like it's not very well explained, and I personally often don't, it doesn't come naturally to me. A lot of this drawing stuff doesn't come naturally.